when you say the American Revolution, it implies that actually the American Revolution was the important outcome of the war which opposed France and Spain to Britain. In a sense, it also implicitly entails that when Vergennes, the very conservative foreign minister of Louis XVI, who was after 1781, after the death of Maurepas, the prime minister, the de facto prime minister in Paris, that Vergennes, basically convinced the king to go to war for the sake of the liberty of the Americans. Yes, the fact is, on the long term, that the main result of the war was the independence of the United States, with all the world consequences that it has. But I would want to emphasize today that actually the War of Independence was only a theater of a much more global confrontation, and a confrontation actually for the world supremacy. In a sense, the insurgents were only the pawns really through which the French and the British were trying once more to settle their score. You'll see when you come to the residence that we have, and you won't be surprised, the portraits of Rochambeau, Lafayette, and Vergennes, by the way. Very often I say, because I'm a bit feisty, I say to my American colleagues, you were very lucky to have the British as colonial power, because if it has been Spain, actually we would have been on the side of Spain. Which is not only to be feisty, but to emphasize the geopolitical significance of the war. The War of Independence was only actually a part of, I have said, of a global confrontation. In a sense, it was only a stage. It's what some French historians call the second 100-year war between France and Britain. The first one is in the Middle Age, and it was concluded by the victory of France. The second one was concluded, unfortunately, in 1815 by the victory of Britain, and it was the war for world supremacy. When did it start? Basically, it started with the Glorious Revolution in 1688, 1689, when William of Orange became the King William III in London, and with what is called the Protestant succession, and when England became the pillar of all the coalitions against Louis XIV, who was accused to try to impose the French hegemony in Europe. There was first what you call, I guess, the 9-year war, what we call the War of the League of Augsburg, between 1689 and 1697, which is interesting in a way because it's defining the scenario of this war. You have on one side the French being victorious on the battlefields in the lowlands, but the other side, and it's new, the British being the master of the sea, and so in a sense being invulnerable. It's a new element, actually, because so far the French fleet of Louis XIV had been able to equal and defeat the fleets of the United Provinces, the Netherlands, and of Britain. So you have the 9-year war with a sort of undecisive French victory and the Treaty of Ryswick. 4 years later, you have the War of Succession of Spain, where again, Britain is creating a coalition against France, and war which is going to the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713 and Treaty of Rastatt in 1714, which is actually a sort of an equal game. It's an equal game. The France is, you have a Bourbon king, which is the grandson of Louis XIV, who is recognized as King of Spain, but at the same time, Britain has been successful to divide the Spanish Empire in Europe in favor of its ally, Austria, and Britain has, really got Gibraltar, and Minorca, which was, in strategic terms, quite significant. So 2 long wars, 25 years of war between France and Britain. 20 years of intermission with two very peaceful prime ministers. In London, Walpole, in Paris, Fleury. And so we have an intermission between 1715 and 1740, basically. And after 1740, we have two new bouts of war between France and Britain. The war of succession of Austria, and with a sort of undecisive French victory. Again, always the same scenario. You know, the French are the winners on the battlefields in the lowlands with the French Maréchal Maurice de Saxe, you know, and the very famous Battle of Fontenoy, at least famous for the French, but undecisive. The game, you know, the game is not over. The 7-Year War. It's certainly the first world war in the history of mankind. 1756, 1763. And this time, it's a decisive war. It's a decisive war because its conclusion is a decisive defeat of the French. I think you call this war the Indian and French War. Actually, its conclusion by the Treaty of Paris in 1763 is basically for the French the loss of Canada and the loss of India. Why? Why did the French lose? I think it's several elements. First, because Britain is an island, you know, really, and has been successful to dedicate most able to dedicate most of its means to the fleet, while the French were always obliged to wage two wars, a continental one and a naval one. And unfortunately, Louis XV didn't understand that the future of the power was not on the battlefields of the lowlands, like his ancestor Louis XIV believed at the time, but that it was the new world, new discovered world, especially in India. And basically, the French decided to use all their means on the continent rather than to have a strong field. The second one was, and we will have this topic coming back during the war of the American Revolution, was the financial problems. The French monarchy has never succeeded to build a financial instrument, the way the English did with the Bank of England created in 1694. Actually, in the 18th century, the money cost, in terms of the rate of interest paid, 3 times more to the French monarchy than to the English. And this financial problem was certainly a major cause of the French failure. While actually people forget that at the time, France was 3 times more populated than England, and its GDP was twice, at least twice the English GDP. So in theory, France has the mean to defeat the US, not Britain. And last element, I think the mediocrity of Louis XV and all the ministers and the generals of the time compared to a man like, for instance, William Pitt the Elder, you know, really where you feel that you have another dimension. And I forget, as for Canada, the simple fact that there were 2 million of inhabitants in the English America and 60,000 in the French Canada, which from the beginning, you know, you could conclude that it was better not to have a war between the two. So 1763, clear British victory. But what is striking is that in France, the humiliation is deeply felt at a time that we can, in a sense, feel, maybe for the first time, a real national spirit. There is, you know, before people were thinking of dying for the king, really, you see, at the end of the 18th century, the idea of the fatherland, the idea of France, and not only in France, as the country beyond the person of the king, which is really appearing. And actually, the defeat of the 7-Year War was also an element of the unpopularity of the late Louis XV. And for the military historians here, if you look at the French fleet during the French Revolution, you see the name of some of the ships we had. You know, you had Bretagne, Brittany, Bourgogne, Burgundy. You had Languedoc, you had the city of Bordeaux, the city of Marseille. You have a lot of these ships who have these names. Why? Because actually the cities and the provinces paid for building this ship. There was a spontaneous mobilization of the French public opinion after 1763 simply to prepare the revenge. So what is striking in the France of the 60s is the will to get a revenge. The French don't consider that, as we say in French, la messe est dite, that the mass has been said. We consider that really next time there will be a French victory. The first opportunity for this revenge could have been actually the first crisis of the Falkland Islands, because actually the Falkland Islands crisis that all of us do know started in 1768, 1769. These islands, which were called at the time les Malouines, you know, are the inhabitants of Saint-Malo, were French islands because they had been discovered by French sailors, but they have been ceded to the Spanish ally. And in 1768-69, the British land on Las Malvinas, on the Spanish islands. There is a crisis to the point that people believe that there could be a war between Spain and England. And considering the alliance between Spain and England, between Spain and France, which is called the Family Pact, because you have the Bourbons, who are in Madrid and who are in Paris, it would have meant the famous War of Revenge. At the time, Louis XV concluded that France was not ready. He was facing a major domestic political crisis, and he decided eventually first to get rid of the minister, Choiseul, who was in favor of a war, and he wrote to his cousin, the King of Spain, Charles III, to tell him that unfortunately he couldn't support Spain in the case of war. And Charles III concluded at the time that he had to cave in front of the English ultimatum. So it's 1770. So came the opportunity offered by the insurgents. And if I have insisted on this geopolitical, with brush stroke, this geopolitical history is to make you understand that when the insurgents start to fight the English, the question in Versailles is not at all, really the future of the Americans, the liberty of Americans, the liberty of the happiness of the world, but it's simply to wonder whether it's not the right opportunity to get our revenge. And that's the reason why, in the beginning of the war, the French are cautious, are bringing a sort of indirect support, bringing an indirect support to the insurgents. There is the very famous story of Beaumarchais. In a sort of very traditional way, the French Secret Service is really trying to channel weapons and money to the insurgents, especially from the French West Indies. But in Versailles, it's wait and see. It's wait and see, and very often it has been argued, but I think the specialist will tell you whether it's right or wrong, that the victory of Saratoga in 1777, the insurgents' victory of Saratoga, could have been the moment when the French concluded that, after all, these insurgents were serious fighters and that we could go to war, and we went to war with Spain. But if we went to war with Spain again, I have the highest respect for the Marquis de Lafayette, really, even if he was not the brightest politician that we have ever had. But he was handsome and courageous and young, which are three qualities that I recognize. And you can be handsome, young, and courageous without being very intelligent. With all the due respect to the Marquis de Lafayette, the problem for Vergennes and for the very absolute Louis XVI, the question was not to liberate the Americans, but was to defeat the British in this global confrontation for, as I've said, for world supremacy. And the war was not only waged on this continent, the war was also waged everywhere, really, especially in India, but also in the West Indies. And the difference with the previous war, which may explain the victory, the final victory, is that the French diplomacy was successful to avoid the creation of a coalition in Europe against France. In a sense, it's the only war that France has waged against Britain without having to fight on the sea and also in Europe. Because after the 7-Year War, there was a sort of a general resentment in Europe against Britain, resentment shared by its usual allies, especially Prussia and Russia, the feeling that the British were in a sense benefiting from the sacrifice of the other. And Vergennes was playing very shrewdly on this feeling, which led to the isolation of Britain in this war. So after the Treaty of Versailles in 1783, in St. Petersburg, in Vienna, in Berlin, the conclusion is not that the Americans are free, because basically, really frankly, they don't care. The conclusion is that France is back and that Britain is defeated. Then the balance of power in Europe has dramatically shifted. As you know, William Pitt the Younger became prime minister in 1782 when he was 23 years old. And when you read his speeches, when you read also his letters, you see that his problem is not the independence of America, because he was convinced that actually before 1782, he was already convinced that it should have been the logical result of the war. His real problem was that now France was threatening England. But you can ask the question, why this geopolitical victory, this revenge, actually led to nowhere. And that you are right to consider that the main outcome, the important, significant outcome of the war was actually the independence of the US. I think it was for several reasons. First, a reason I've given, which is William Pitt the Younger, the Younger, who really, when becoming prime minister, is going to give, in a sense, to Britain a sort of a new momentum, a new energy. Really, financial reorganization of the finance, for instance, because Britain is nearly bankrupt in 1783. But again, financial reorganization. Secondly, also rebuilding the fleet. As you know, I think some historians will tell you the quality of the French ships during the war is superior to the British ships, especially because of Borda, the great French engineer, even if the British seamen are certainly more trained and superior to the French seamen. So the fleet, the finance, and secondly, actually, your America is independent, but it's not, in fact, independent in economic terms. And very quickly, after 1783, all the economic relationship, the trade relationship between especially the New England and England, are back immediately. And the French, there is a treaty of trade between France and the US, but it has hardly any consequence because all the trade of this country has been organized in one century has been organized to work in relationship with England. And very quickly, the financial and trade relationship between Liverpool, Bristol, and Boston, and so on, are back, and the French will never be able to enter the American market. Another point on the French side is simply that the cost of the war was crashing. As I've said previously, the French monarchy was unable to build a sound financial system, and the war has really, basically, at the death of Louis XV, the French debt was 2 billion of French pound. At the time, the budget was 300 millions. And at the end of the war, the French debt was 3 billion of French pounds. In a sense, the monarchy was nearly bankrupt. And so it explains largely why, after the war, you have a reinvigorated Britain with William Pitt. You have a very strong relationship between the former enemies, and you have France entering a deep crisis, which is first financial and which will become political, especially after the death of Versailles in 1786, with the weak Louis XVI. The war will go on, and there will be the Revolutionary Wars, which led to the French victory with the Peace of Amiens in 1802, where the British recognized actually the French hegemony in Europe. This peace couldn't last. It lasted less than 1 year, and eventually everything was settled on the battlefield of Waterloo on June 18th, 1815. And unfortunately, really, that was the final set. The world supremacy was recognized to Britain. So I didn't want to reduce the importance of the war of revolution, the Revolutionary War. I really do know that the independence of the United States was, for all the reasons I've really tried to give you very quickly, is the real outcome of what has been done. But I thought it was necessary to try to frame this war in the wider geopolitical context in which it was seen. It was seen in Versailles, but it was also seen largely in Madrid, in London, St. Petersburg, Vienna, as this incredible and long 100-year war that we had with our British friends. I remind you what Spencer, the English poet, said in the 16th century: France, our sweet enemy. But we have also to recognize that since 1815, we have never been at war with our British friends, which doesn't mean that we have always been friends, but mainly we have been friends with Britain as we have been with the United States. Thank you very much.